So our next speaker also comes from the University of Michigan. I promise this isn't only University of Michigan speakers today, but go blue for those who went there. Kit McCullough is an urban designer and a lecturer in urban design at College. I also know her from my time at the university and taking classes in studios together. So the phrase, "I don't have a car," is something that we keep hearing more and more from young professionals nowadays. And so this is a great segue to what Kit is going to talk about, which her presentation titled "The Urbanism of New Mobility: How the Transportation Revolution Can Transform Chicago." So thinking about getting around without a car and all the different ways that we can find alternate ways to move around. So Kit's going to reveal everything about from bike to scooter renting to autonomous vehicles and how they're going to impact Chicago's neighborhoods. So welcome, Kit.
Thanks. I'm mic'd, but I don't know that the mic's turned on.
Everyone here does not sound like
it's video only. The mic is for the video only.
Ah, okay. So,
Use the hand mic.
what's that?
You can use the hand mic.
Use the hand mic, or I'll just talk loud, just like in class. So today I have actually a lot to talk about, but I want to kind of get through things quickly enough that we have enough time for discussion, because I would be especially interested to hear your thoughts and ideas and questions about the future of mobility in the region. But before we get started, let's find out how you got here today. So who here drove into the city? Who took a train? Oh, wow. A bus? Anybody bike? Ah, you're brave. With the weather outside. Anybody walk? Yeah, those of us staying in the hotel next door. Anybody take a scooter along the way? Yeah. So this diversity of transportation is actually fairly new, even for a city like Chicago. I lived in Chicago in the late 1980s. I moved here fresh out of architecture school. And my friends and I, we chose to live in the city. And we were kind of the first young people to make this choice in quite some time. We think of the return to the city as a millennial thing, but research has shown that it actually started with the Gen Xers. And so I'm going to take a little Gen Xer pride here. Not every trend was invented by the millennials. The Chicago that I moved to was the Chicago that was depicted in the movie About Last Night, in the 1980s version, not the remake from 2001. And so like Rob Lowe and Demi Moore, we lived in the city, we worked in the city, we played in the city, along with our friends like Jim Belushi. And we crowded restaurant sidewalks on weekends for this thing called brunch. The term yuppie was invented for us, young urban professionals. And this was also a time when new housing started to be developed in the city again, especially on the near north side, as well as new urban playgrounds like the River North Gallery District. And, but our mobility options at the time were still fairly limited. You didn't want to own a car because you had no place to put it. I actually had a friend who bought this beat-up old station wagon for $100. He called it the Starship Enterprise. And he figured for his $100 investment, he could just park it anywhere, let the tickets accrue, and then when it got booted, he would walk away. And then the Starship Enterprise lasted for almost a year. Cycling was also difficult. There was hardly any bike infrastructure. There was the path along the lakefront, but it was mostly recreational. I did have a friend who had this dirt bike with fat tires, and he really liked to mix it up with the urban traffic and jump curbs and hop over potholes. But for the rest of us normal people, we didn't have that many ways to get around. We walked, we took the bus or rode the L. Sometimes we took taxis, but not very often. They were kind of expensive. And you couldn't just like summon them with your phone. You actually had to go stand on the curb and hail them. And that was not always so easy to do. My office was near Cabrini Green, and so it wasn't always that easy to find a cab. And you had to pay with cash, so you had to make sure you had enough cash on you. But fortunately, ATMs had just been invented. But with the millennials and the size of that cohort, urban living has really, really exploded. Blocks of new housing have been built. All the inner city neighborhoods are gentrifying and becoming hip and cool, a process that's continuing. So you know that story. And our options for mobility have really grown as well. And so maybe there are some trends that the millennials are responsible for. As Grant was saying, and there are people here today, I know from the Shared Use Mobility Center, that know the statistics better than I do, but suffice it to say that millennials are driving less, they're not getting their licenses, they're not buying cars or vehicles, they prefer access to the car. So why own a car when you can access a car through Car2Go or Zipcar? And the same thing with bikes. And they're moving to subscription models. So just like Netflix, you have a subscription to Divvy to use when you want. But it's not just millennials. Everybody is looking for options, choices, and how they get around. To be able to take a bike in the morning, when it's a nice day, but then take Car2Go home when you need to run errands or it's about to pour rain, or to be able to take the train when you need to work. So we're at a point of disruption in mobility, and people are demanding new ways to use their streets and use their cities. And and I say, Chicago is actually doing a good job of meeting this demand, especially with the cycling infrastructure. All these investments are paying off because this is what people want, and so it's having an impact. And what this means is, ultimately we have fewer cars, we have less vehicular miles traveled, we have less parking, less congestion, and we have more walking, biking, and transit. And this means we have healthier, cleaner, greener, and more affordable cities and infrastructure. So now we can start to think about how to rebalance our transportation system and modes, and how we can reclaim our streets and our public realm. We can start to think about moving away from fitting the city around the transportation system, which is what we have been doing, and asking the design of the transportation system to serve the city that we want. Now, to do this, then, we have to ask ourselves, why do we travel? And we travel to get to places. So it really isn't the travel that matters so much as it is the place. We want to get to places where we can socialize and recreate and shop, go to work, go to school. So in planning circles, the argument is it's not mobility that we want, it's not really movement, it's accessibility. We want to be able to access our needs in our city. So if you start to think about these things in terms of accessibility rather than transportation, now we're thinking about things in terms of the user. And not the user of transportation, not the user of CTA or Divvy, but the user of the city. So how can we make the city easier to use? The cities that we've been building around the car aren't so great and aren't necessarily so easy to use. The car takes up an enormous amount of space. And so it starts to push things apart, and it creates this inhumanely scaled environment, and one that's fairly dangerous. 5 Chicagoans will be seriously injured today. I hope it's not one of you. At least 2 Chicagoans will be killed this week. So that adds up to 2,000 Chicagoans killed or seriously injured in collisions every year. So that's why this move towards shared mobility and mobility options and mobility as a service is so important. Because as we have more options, then we can move away from the car, and we have other ways to get around. And it makes the city easier to use. We can go where we want, when we want, how we want, whether it's a bike or Uber or transit. So we're making the city easier to use. And the shared mobility also means fewer cars, fewer miles driven, lower car usage, as well as fewer cars on the road. So this can help us to reduce what I'm calling our transportation footprint. So like carbon footprint or ecological footprint, we can start to think about our mode choices in terms of their impacts on others, how much space and resources are consumed, how much pollution is generated. And in doing that, we can start to plan our region towards lowering our transportation footprint. We can reprioritize what sorts of infrastructure we spend our transportation dollars on. We can start to move away from infrastructure that consumes the city and drains value from its surroundings. And we can start building infrastructure that generates economic activity and creates quality urban environments, like San Francisco did when they replaced the Embarcadero Freeway with an esplanade. What this means, fewer cars means more city, more room for more stuff. More city means more stuff to access, greater access. And so if we're going to try to plan the accessible city, that means we're planning urban fabric and not transportation. So again, we're fitting the transportation to the city, not vice versa. And also, as we start to plan accessible neighborhoods, we need to move beyond the urban core. And neighborhoods throughout the region deserve mobility options and quality environments. One way to begin to do this is through a concept called 20-minute neighborhoods. This is an idea that originated in Portland, our favorite poster child city. Bless them. And the idea is that you should be able to access most of your daily needs in a 20-minute bike or walk. 20-minute neighborhoods are the most desirable neighborhoods in every region, even though they have all the stuff people say they don't want. They have density, they have commercial uses, they have limited parking. But this is my neighborhood in Ann Arbor, the Old West Side, a fantastic 20-minute neighborhood. Everybody wants to live here. So Portland has tried to measure their 20-minute neighborhoods, and they look at 3 metrics. So distance to which they call the 3Ds, conveniently enough, distance to destinations, and then the quality, number, and type of destinations, and then the density that's required to support those destinations. And they found that only 6% of Portlanders live in this sort of white-hot core of the neighborhood with the rich 20-minute neighborhood. And so this is the Portland we know from Portlandia, where hipsters sit out on sidewalks in the rain. But the majority of Portlanders, almost 70%, live in neighborhoods with few elements of the 20-minute neighborhood. So Portland has set an ambitious target of having 90% of their population living in 20-minute neighborhoods. And they're doing this by investing in transit and pedestrian infrastructure, and then also zoning and policies to support the development of more retail and more housing density. Detroit has reframed their rebuilding around the idea of the 20-minute neighborhood. And it's laid on top of the green archipelago that Maria talked about earlier. In a city where a quarter of the households have no access to a car, being able to get to your daily needs on foot or bike is critical. So Detroit is doing this by investing in robust bike infrastructure throughout the city, so you can reach most of the city by bike. And they also have programs in place to help support the development of more new neighborhood services. So one example is the Green Grocer program, where they're working with grocers and trying to attract new grocers to open up new stores, including co-ops and markets and corner stores. And they have a corridor development, commercial corridor development program where, again, they're working with business owners to help open up new businesses, entrepreneurs, to get more retailers in the storefronts. And they have a grant and technical assistance program to help people rehab the apartments over the shops. The key to the 20-minute neighborhood is density. Portland estimates that you need 12 to 18 dwelling units per acre to support a 20-minute neighborhood. And this is actually a pretty low bar, and much of Chicago meets this threshold. This neighborhood in Hyde Park is probably around 20 units an acre. Before we had cars, all neighborhoods were 20-minute neighborhoods. They were naturally dense and diverse because you had to live close enough to your shopping and your work. But with the with the advent of post-war zoning, we built swaths of areas where it's all single-family housing, low density, with commercial services put far away, so you have to drive to get there. And we built so much of this stuff that and now people are looking for more accessibility in their neighborhoods. That the neighborhoods that offer that mixed use and accessibility are under tremendous development pressure. They're gentrifying and there's displacement. And any neighborhood with a pulse is gentrifying. So we need to build more 20-minute neighborhoods to meet the demand. Developers know that, especially the two largest cohorts, millennials and baby boomers, are looking for urban living. So they are busy building apartments for the millennials and condos for the empty nesters. But this isn't really helping to create 20-minute neighborhoods. The development industry is still fossilized around the single-use zoning, automobile-oriented development model. The whole structure, finance, policy is really hard for them to break out of that. And so developers typically only build one thing. Developers build apartment buildings, condo developers build condos, and nobody can build retail. They have a very hard time including retail as part of their projects. So we're not getting 20-minute neighborhoods. We're really getting the same, single-use, automobile-dominant environments, just with more density. So we have to ask more of our developers. And so Detroit is doing just that. This is a new development, City Modern in Brush Park. It's under construction now. And it's providing a diversity of housing types. So it'll accommodate people of all ages and life stages. But perhaps even more critically, there's a significant amount of retail, 25,000 square feet, so enough to create a retail destination for the neighborhood. Similarly, Cabrini Green has been redeveloping with diversity of housing types and quite a bit of retail. So again, creating that mixed use neighborhood services. Another strategy is to look at our commercial corridors. So every city has these arterials with low density, low rise commercial uses along them. And so they're ripe for redevelopment. In Austin, they have a new zoning category called vertical mixed use that they've applied to their key transit corridors. So developers can redevelop these commercial parcels as residential, which is what they want to do, that's where the market is. But they're required to include retail or office on the ground floor. And then there's design guidelines that also make sure that they provide a pedestrian streetscape. At the regional scale, Columbus, Ohio has a regional strategy to concentrate their future development along 5 key transit corridors. And they think by doing this, they're going to save $10 billion in infrastructure costs. But they're also doing it for economic strategy reasons, because people are looking for this accessibility in where they live. And so by creating that fabric, they'll be able to attract more people. And accessibility to work as well. There's a quote from the development director that, to be able to say, I live in Linden and I can access 300,000 jobs by transit, that changes the trajectory of people's lives. So it is an important strategy. Another thing we can do is we can try to make our existing neighborhoods more dense, at least dense enough that they can begin to support neighborhood services as well. Minneapolis has been making waves they recently just across the board changed all of their single family zoning to, you now can build up to 3 units on any parcel zoned single family. So it's now legal to build an accessory dwelling unit or to subdivide your house into a duplex or triplex. And this can have a significant impact. A study by the Center for Neighborhood Technologies found that if 1/3 of the houses in a typical single-family neighborhood were to add 1 unit, say to put an accessory dwelling unit in their backyard, that it would reduce driving by 1,000 miles per household per year. So that is not insignificant. We also need to provide these accessible environments for all ages. You know, we think of the urban living, again, as this millennial thing, and that when they get older and get married and have kids, they'll move to the suburbs and buy a car. And this is sad. For one thing, it impoverishes our urban environments if there's no children and families living in them. But it's also, I think, sad for the children. The city is a great place to grow up. I just finished reading Michelle Obama's memoir, and she talked about how coming from the South Side to go to high school in downtown really broadened her horizons and encouraged her to seek wider worlds. So just, the urban environment, allows, I think, children to develop an independence and perspective that's really important. So we need to provide housing for families in our cities. I just read in the Wall Street Journal that older millennials and younger Gen Xers are leaving Chicago because they can't find housing that meets their needs. And we need to design our infrastructure to serve families as well. And it's not just children and families, but our seniors also need a walkable, accessible environment. As we age, we're going to stop driving. We outlive our driving years by about a decade. And so we need to be able to get where we can go on foot. And seniors need a walkable environment because it encourages them to be physically active and socially engaged. And again, we need to think about the housing that we're building. Already in the US, 20% of all households are multi-generational. It's an all-time high. And this is because of the aging baby boomers, but also immigrants and sort of more cultural traditions of living multi-generational. And a recent survey found that of people in the market for a new home, 41% were looking to house an adult relative. So there's significant demand for this kind of housing that we need to think about how we provide it. And we need accessible neighborhoods for all income levels as well. These neighborhoods need to be affordable. So I think one important strategy is to co-locate affordable housing with affordable transit. Maria was talking about the Q line in Detroit in the previous in her talk. But there are other ways to provide transit throughout the region that serves the needs better. And I understand this is an illustration of a proposal for a BRT on Western Avenue. And I understand there's a proposal for BRT on Ashland as well. And I read that 25% of Chicagoans live in a quarter mile of Western or Ashland. And so if you put BRT on those routes, now you're making Chicago transit accessible for 25% of the population. We also need to co-locate employment with transit. So as when we think about transit-oriented development, we should think about that as developing employment centers as well. Employers want to be located near transit so their employees can get to work. It broadens their labor pool. But we also need to make jobs accessible, especially for our lower wage earners, to be able to get to work without having to rely on a car. And this doesn't need to only be transit. Bikes as a mode of transportation is already a very important mode for lower income people because it's so affordable. We think of bikes as the young urban professional biking into downtown for work, but really lower wage workers rely heavily on the bike, and so we need to recognize that, and we need to provide cycling infrastructure throughout the region to serve those populations. And then a bit of a no-brainer, build housing near employment so people have the opportunity to walk to work. So this brings me to my next beef, is we need to quit giving valuable urban space for the storage of cars. This space could be housing so people could walk to work instead of having to drive into the city to get to their jobs. Quit giving away urban space for cars. And sort of related to that is, we need to quit requiring parking as part of every development. I don't own a car, and yet I'm required by law to own a parking space. How crazy is that? As much as 30% of housing costs is because of parking. So the low-hanging fruit of making housing more affordable is just get rid of the parking. And then we have reduced the cost of housing by 30%. Instead, we should think of parking as a shared utility. So much like shared mobility, car shares, this is much more efficient because multiple users can use the same space. And it also means that it's fairly paid for fairly as well. You're not paying for it as part of the development. You're paying the direct cost to use that utility. And as we build parking, we should design it so that it can be repurposed, maybe used differently at different times a day. This is my favorite parking lot in Ann Arbor, Bill's Beer Garden. By day, it's the parking lot for the store next door. The store closes at 6 and the beer garden tables come out. So it's a very sort of efficient use of urban space. And we can also be sure to build parking that can be repurposed when that's no longer the highest and best use. So build cheap decks that just get torn down when there's a better use for that property. And so then we can replace that parking with more city, more stuff, more accessibility. We can also start to rethink different uses for our streets. We can start to consider car-free streets like they are in Europe. This is Pontevedra in Spain. Perhaps they're car-free for only part of the day. In this street in Amsterdam, during the day, it's accessed by cars and delivery trucks, but at 5 o'clock, bollards come up, and then it becomes a social space for the neighborhood. Or we can start to think about how different systems of different uses for the streets might work. So in Barcelona, they have what they call a super block strategy, where there's this larger grid for vehicles, and then the interior streets are pedestrianized. Now, for a strategy like this, you would need an urban fabric with a very regular grid structure. And we can start to apportion urban space more fairly. So again, thinking about that transportation footprint, we should prioritize those modes with the lowest transportation footprint. So buses and bikes should get dedicated lanes, for example. And we should also start to think about how we use the curb space. There's increasing competition for the curb, from Amazon deliveries to Uber pickups to bike stations. So we shouldn't just be giving it away, again, for people to store their personal vehicles, but we should start pricing it fairly and using that to manage demand. And we should start to make space in our urban environment for new kinds of vehicles and a new scale of vehicles. So a lot of people are annoyed at the scooters because they're competing for that precious space that pedestrians and cyclists have. That space is already so scarce, and now here's another user making demands on that space. We need to make more space for that scale. We no longer have this dichotomy of the pedestrian scale and the car scale. Now we have the scale of this in-between scale that's actually better scaled for the urban environment. And so there's increasingly new kinds of vehicles. Again, people are looking for new ways to use their streets, and we should accommodate that. And what all this will do is make for a better quality urban environment. So again, it's not mobility, and it really isn't accessibility. In the end, what it really is about is livability. And the ease of use of the city, again. So, interaction, in the field of interaction design, they talk about how the interface with technology should be seamless and intuitive. And similarly, the interface with our cities should be natural and intuitive and easy. So I have a story about my son that's going to illustrate what I mean. So when he was 14, He's going to go to the library. So he gets on his bike, and I'm working in the front yard, and I see him coasting down the street on his bicycle, and he sees a girl that he likes walking with a friend. So he hops off his bike, and he's walking alongside them. And a few minutes later, I get a text. Mom, I'm not going to the library. I'm going to the movies with Camille and Alexa. And that's exactly what we need from our city, you know, to be able to just turn on a dime when you see a girl that you like. You know, the city should support these moments of serendipity. If, you know, young people are going around in their autonomous pods, how are they ever going to find true love? How are they going to meet up with the girl that they like? What the city really is for bringing people together. And I really like this image, you know, because it's romantic. But also for me, it, you know, illustrates just the sort of casualness and flexibility and adaptability of a mode, a vehicle like the bike. So I tried to find an image like this, but with a divvy bike, and I couldn't find one. But I did find lots of divvy weddings, which apparently is a thing. So proving that, yes, indeed, shared mobility can bring people together. So, so these are my thoughts on the future of mobility and how they might be shaped in Chicago. But as promised, I think we've got some time to hear your thoughts, questions, and discussion.
I'm going to come around with the mic so we can questions, you know.
Thanks, Professor. Question, where do you see, this looks, especially to a bunch of metropolitan people, very intuitive and something that we should do. Where do you see objections to this and workarounds?
Well, I think people have a hard time imagining life without a car. And so there's always still lots of pushback when you try to take space away from the car, because the car's been so privileged. You know, what do the activists say? Losing privilege feels like an attack. I can't remember the exact phrase, but yeah, the car's been so privileged that to take away that privilege is really hard for people to accept. And so, you know, even just walking here, the 4 blocks, you know, there's like this 8-lane, one-way street in the heart of downtown Chicago. So there's lots of changes to be made, but I think, you know, what's hopeful is that so many people want something else, that you know, the sort of political tides are turning, and we're seeing things like the investments in bike lanes, you know, dramatically increasing cycling, because that's, you know, people want that and they're responding to that.
Kit, I wonder what I understand your last comment about autonomous vehicles don't necessarily get us interacting in the same sort of serendipitous way as we see here. But what I'm interested in with the AV phenomenon is the notion of mobility services of shared vehicles. In other words, that we no longer own them, but that we're part of mobility systems, sharing vehicles with lots of different people, which I think could create another kind of social network that the individually owned automobile doesn't. So what are your thoughts about the transformation of our transportation system into a shared mobility service system? Yeah,
so the nightmare is that the autonomous vehicle would just be business as usual, and everyone will have their own car. And you know, as the technology is being deployed bit by bit, you know, everybody's going out and buying their Tesla, so now it's making driving even easier. You know, you can do these long distance commutes. But you know, the Teslas are pretty expensive. And you know, what I've heard from the autonomous vehicle researchers is they see the vehicles and the software being so complicated that true autonomous vehicles can't be privately owned. It's going to be a shared fleet. And this is what I think Ford and the automobile companies are anticipating. Maria showed the train station, which is their research center for that. So I think that is critical that they are shared, because once they are shared, then it's not your only option. You know, right now you own a car, so that's why you have to drive your car. You have that sunk cost, and it's right there. But if you don't own a car, then you start to think, well, should I, call up a car, or should I just hop on a bike? Oh, here's a scooter. So it at least gives choices.
Just to tie together those two previous questions a little bit, I think part of getting people interested in this stuff, it comes from policy or regulatory environment that puts pressures to take you out of your comfort zone. Mm-hmm. And then once you're in that space and you realize how easy it is and how much better your life is, then you really start to become attached to it. So I gave up my car 6 years ago due to pressures of it was just too difficult to have it. And I've been car free for 6 years, and it's amazing. And part of what's come along with that is, well, I can't go get groceries now when I move to a new area. So that's led me into discovering things like Instacart and getting those delivered and saving time and money. And so I think these sort of new pressures, if it comes through policy, will really influence things in a positive way. And I really agree about the parking, taking that out. In fact, putting the opposite. Pressures of if a developer is saying we want to have X amount of car spaces, they'll get penalized if, say, they don't provide those as higher floor heights or more incentive that could be adaptively reused into office or living units after those cars disappear out of the city. So maybe more of a comment to those discussions rather than a question. But thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Kid. A couple of quickies. Scott Bernstein, a name well known in Chicago, last night at a celebration of the 40th anniversary of the Center for Neighborhood Technology. At the end, on stage, all dignitaries was given a bike.
Ah.
It looked very much like this photo. A folding bike, not a shared bike. But the sharing economy, it's not just shared transportation, it's shared living, shared working, shared, you name it, seems to be attractive and appealing to the younger generations, and certainly as its economies. Walk score, I wanted to mention. Did you mention walk score?
No. But
So walk score you can get by going to mywalkscore.com in about 3 minutes. And not only will it give you a walk score, which measures the distance to every place you want or need to go, but it'll give you a transit score. And it'll give you your bike score instantaneously. And now when Wall Street looks at investing in real estate investment trusts, these giant real estate investments, one of the first things they look at now is walk score. So the market cares about this.
yeah.
Thank you for the talk, it was really cool. I was wondering if you could comment on transportation asymmetries in regions like Chicago, like many other cities. A lot of people are living outside the city, commuting in. I'm wondering if there's any discussions on how to rebalance some of those asymmetries in our major metropolitan areas.
Yeah, so I'm by no means an expert on Chicago, and the transit system is a little more difficult because it's so reliant on federal funding and politics, and all that is geared towards the automobile. 99% of our transportation funding goes to automobile infrastructure, while nationally, 20 to 30% of trips are by other modes. So the funding is unequal. In terms of the region, though, and other modes, I did have a slide in here, and I took it out because it's a little critical and unfair, but it shows all of the bike infrastructure and how much denser it is on the north side of the city than it is to the south side of the city. And the same thing with the divvy stations. I had another image that shows where economic hardship is and where economic wealth is, and all the divvy stations are in the wealthier areas. When it's the lower income people that would really benefit the most, like in Detroit, from these options. And again, it's unfair because there's other sort of market forces and things that are driving those decisions, but I think it's a really important and sort of critical thing to think about. And then also on transit, the BRT proposals, which we're also discussing in Detroit and Southeast Michigan, I think is a very important way to provide transit where it's needed in an affordable manner.
Do you think we'll ever get to a collective comprehensive vision of what is the best city? Because a lot of times there's delay in the American dream. The people that have cars now, we want to convince them that to use other forms of transportation, get rid of their cars, but they have the freedom to choose that. Whereas a lot of people in lower classes or different income levels, they have no choice and they use these services, but there's the delay on, I still wish for that freedom of the car. And so while people that have the freedom to choose and are at a higher income move toward these alternative modes, we still have this delay in the American dream of what freedom looks like. To me, being younger and looking at the world in a different way and in a decent place in life, the freedom to me is to not have my car.
Yeah.
But to a lot of people and friends that don't have that choice, the freedom is to have a car.
Because they don't know how hard it is. That's a really good question, and I'm optimistic. This love affair with the car is really a baby boomer phenomenon. It was really the baby boomers. You think of the movie American Graffiti. All through the 70s and 80s and the McMansions, all that sort of focus on car ownership and the love of the car is really kind of just one generation. And they're finding out that they're going to need options. They think they're going to age in place, but then they look around and start to think, well, what happens when I don't drive? They're going to expect the autonomous vehicles to save them. But maybe aspirations, I think, are changing with new generations, hopefully.
Thanks, I really love your talk. As an older millennial who had kids, bought a minivan, and moved to the suburbs, I saw myself in a lot of what you were saying. What I think about a lot is how to move children around the city, and so I wondered if you could speak to that a little bit more. I mean, how can we encourage people to just choose not to drive, even if they did buy a minivan? It seems to me the big battle is just getting them to choose something else sometime.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I hear that all the time. That once you have kids, you have to have a car. I raised a kid without a car and found the experience very rich. It's just so much more important for the child's development to walk places and interact with an urban environment than to spend, most of their waking hours in the back seat, looking at the back seat of the seat in front of them. But it's difficult. I think I could only do it because I had one kid. But I know parents that have multiple kids that have to be in multiple places. Ballet's over here and soccer's over here, and people are running around like crazy. And that's also, I think, a real shame. It puts such a burden on parents. So the 20-minute neighborhood, again, if we can make those things accessible by walking and biking, will really help parents out. And especially, once kids get old enough, like 10, they can go by themselves. And so, my son biked a wide swath of Ann Arbor and our neighborhood, starting at the age of 10, which I think was really important for his development and sense of independence. But then we have to make the infrastructure safe. It's ironic that parents drive their kids to school because they don't think it's safe for them to walk because of traffic. And then I had another slide that I took out because I thought I had too many slides. I live near an elementary school, and then it's ringed with all these vehicles idling, waiting to pick up their kids. And these are parents that feed their children, all organic everything, and they don't have any plastic in the house, and yet they will spew these particulates at their children's school. So the dilemmas that we put parents in, I think, are really troubling, and I think need to be addressed in a myriad of ways. I'm following the microphone.
Mine's more of an anecdotal, evangelical kind of comment, but I'm a Gen X, early Gen X, like yourself, and I've lived in the urban environment pretty much all my life, and I feel like what's happening right now is really exciting, and I don't want to, for me personally, I think what's really exciting about all of this, and you did comment, but I want to highlight a little bit more, is it's not a cost of ownership thing for me. It's not that it's cheaper to have all these or that I'm holding onto a car or whatever. What's really making this all work is the multimodal aspect of it and the accessibility aspect of it. The fact that I can go from one part of the city one way and another part of the city another way, a different mode for a short version, another mode for a longer version, is this networking effect, I think, is what's really
and you don't have to figure out where you're going to put your car at each end.
And I don't have to plan for it. It's not mine. This is really important. It's not my concern. Once I drop it off, it's not mine.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to do with it doesn't have to do with cost of ownership. It just has to do with making the city livable and accessible.
I was wondering, a lot of these systems are working really well during the 8 to 9 months of great weather, and during the 3 to 4 months in the winter when it gets really bad in the northern climates. Does the city have a way of compensating for the inability to ride a scooter through 12 inches of slush? I'm just trying to figure out how, in your planning, how have you been accommodating the really nasty periods of time? And my son goes to school in Minneapolis, and clearly he can get around anytime. I walked for years in the winter. I hate the buses. I'd rather walk. But there are people who are unable to do that kind of a walk. And I was wondering, what's the city doing during those times of the year?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I know in Ann Arbor, the scooters all disappear in November. And then, like birds, they reappear in April. And the same thing with bicycle infrastructure. So Ann Arbor's building its first protected bike lane, about time. And the question is whether they're going to keep it clear in the winter. It's riding, I'm a cyclist, I bike places. To me, the problem with riding in the winter isn't the cold. It's actually easier to bike in cold than in heat. You just bundle up more. It's whether or not the path is clear, because the slush all ends up in the curb space where the bicyclists are supposed to be. In Europe, they have figured this out, and they keep that infrastructure clear. So, that middle scale of scooter, bike, other little vehicles, the infrastructure needs to have just as much priority in keeping it clear as the streets. And the same thing with sidewalks. And this is personal because last winter I slipped on an icy sidewalk, broke my wrist, had surgery. It was a huge imposition on my life, and it's because the city doesn't keep the sidewalks as clear as they do the streets. It's left up to the property owners rather than being part of the utilities. So again, it's part of this prioritization that I think needs to be addressed.
Hi. You alluded to this a couple times during your presentation. I was wondering if you could expound on it. As we are adding these innovations to different communities and like active 20-minute neighborhoods, desirable, but the market forces those prices then go up. How do you make these innovations in the neighborhood without displacing the people that live there? Specifically speaking from gentrification.
Yeah. So, the sad thing is, we want places to stay crappy so they stay cheap. That this is our strategy to keeping places affordable. It's just make them unpleasant places to live, and then nobody wants to live there, and then poor people can afford it. So I think part of it is if we deploy the infrastructure more equitably and there's more of it, then there's not so much pressure on those neighborhoods that do have bicycle infrastructure or pedestrian infrastructure is one strategy. And then there's other affordability strategies like community land trusts and ways to try to keep values from rising too much and displacing people. But gentrification's a knotty, K-N-O-T-T-Y issue, problem that's hard to solve.
Professor, thank you for introducing me to the concept of 20-minute neighborhoods. I love it, it's fantastic. I was curious on your further thoughts on a couple of things that people have brought up as far as effective strategies when it comes to messaging. So here in Chicago, I'm a longtime Chicago resident, we tend to have, when they introduce these type of infrastructure changes, aldermen will frequently have community meetings. And frequently the pushback that you'll hear from longtime residents within some of these neighborhoods, and that will be a thing that gets brought up. I didn't move into this neighborhood for this type of change to be made, but frequently in these desirable neighborhoods, they frequently are access points and gateway points, whether they're close to bus rapid transit, whether they're low-stress bike lanes to desirable assets of the city, like Lincoln Park Zoo, the Lakefront Trail. What do you think are effective strategies to messaging to help ease buy-in when it comes to things like this?
Yeah, so again, I think demands are changing, and we can point to successful stories. Always, to me, it's weird that people would rather have cars coming through their neighborhood than to shift some of those cars to bikes or walkers. That they would be against a change like that. And I think people are just biased against change. But at the same time, I think there's a fairness issue. And the idea of transportation footprint can help, I think, illustrate that fairness. So many times, people don't want to lose the parking space in front of their building to a bike lane. But how fair is that? That they have essentially privatized that street space so that nobody can bike through there safely. I also think safety is another important argument. I mean, those statistics that I showed came from the Chicago Vision Zero plan, and they're appalling. So that alone is something we have to solve. If those deaths were caused by any other means, there would be an outcry. We would be grounding Boeing jetliners, and there would be change. And so, I think that's also an important argument. When the car was first introduced into our cities, the streets were places where everybody used, walkers, trams. Some of you might have seen like the old footage of streets at the turn of the century where just everybody's moving through the street at will. Parents would actually tell their children, go play in the street. And then, the car came along, and suddenly people were dying because cars would hit people and they would die. And so there were these headlines, child killers. We got to get these cars out of our streets, because they're killing us. They're killing machines. And so, the car manufacturers and lobby. This was when the AAA American Automobile Association was formed to change our mindset, to lobby for a different perception of the street. And so it was a very successful campaign. There's a whole book called Fighting Traffic, and I've forgotten the author's name. It's an excellent book that goes through this history where they actually changed our mindset that the street space is for cars and that we, other users, need to stay on the sidewalk and only use crosswalks. And if we get hit, it's our fault for being in the car space and not vice versa.
Any other questions, comments?
I hate to make such a negative comment, but I kind of live in suburbia, and when I initially moved to where I live, it was a couple miles from where I work, and that's frankly why I moved there. And then I built a house there, and all of a sudden our office moves. And you look at how I get from point A to point B, it'd be virtually impossible to do without a car unless I invested 4 hours of my day. And I think what you're talking about works very effectively in urban environments with high density and the economic ability to support those kind of mechanisms. I mean, short of starting all over with suburbia, I mean, how do you do that considering the existing, suburban structure?
Yeah, and I think it's also important to say that, that this isn't going to be for everybody, but clearly it's for more people than there is these kinds of environments, which is why all the walkable neighborhoods and urban areas are skyrocketing in land values because so many people want to live like this. But there are suburban areas that we're not going to change. But also within the suburbs, especially the older ones, there's usually sort of a nucleus of neighborhood services. So you can at least walk to part of your trips, even if you have to drive to work. And so even that, I think, is something that people are looking for. And things like school locations, we should go back to the neighborhood schools so children can walk to school. Lots of policies that can push us towards that sort of scale of land planning and regional planning.
Yeah, along the same lines on a point, I'm interested in your perspective just from your personal life. I work in, or I live in Ypsilanti actually, but I do work in Ann Arbor, Detroit, Grand Rapids, all over, Chicago, do some work at times. And so it's hard for me to not obviously be able to get there without a car. You said you haven't had a car for a long time. When you made that switch, was that hard to even get here, that time that it takes to get an Uber to the airport, get an Uber to wherever? I mean, even then you're using a car. So how was that? Was that a process for you? Did you have to overcome some challenges in time, et cetera?
Truthfully, not really. I always hated driving. So when I was in college, I didn't have a car. They were really expensive. When I graduated, moved to Chicago, I didn't have a car. Then I moved to Florida, and I didn't have a car. And that was more challenging, but I lived near work, and then I biked everywhere else, and I took a cab when I needed to. Then I moved back to Texas and got a car. And but as soon as I could buy a house in the center of the city where I could walk to work, I got rid of that car. It was a financial burden, it was a hassle, and I just hate driving. I'm a nervous driver. So I've mostly lived without a car and have tried to figure out how to make do. And it's gotten easier and easier as there's more options to do that. So, in the Ann Arbor example, actually the easiest way to get to the airport is by bus. There's now this direct bus air ride, drops you right off at the door. You don't have to do the long-term parking thing and ride the shuttle. It's cheaper than the Uber. It's actually more reliable than an Uber. There's bikes, and Ubers when I need them, and the bus system in Ann Arbor is really robust. So Ann Arbor works really, really well without a car, and I know lots of people that are car-free. I used to be weird. You know, people would always be so shocked. You don't have a car? How do you do that? But now I meet people all the time, and no one's surprised that I don't own a car in Ann Arbor.
Thanks. What do you see? Weather was mentioned. What do you see Sunbelt cities doing, especially areas that don't have a history or legacy of transit? And I'm not talking about LA, which seems to have some, but like Phoenix or other places. Thanks.
Yeah. So LA is really doubling down on transit and walkability. They're kind of a leader in that regard. And Atlanta. In Austin, which is where I'm from, lots of this stuff was really developed and kind of incubated in Austin. And that's because traffic in Austin is so bad, people are looking for alternatives to driving. And so, so Austin is getting to the point where most people, I shouldn't say most people, but a lot of people are car-free, and the city's responding to that with the infrastructure and development policies. But Phoenix, other cities, not so much. And you know, I think they're starting to find that it's hurting them economically. People don't want to live someplace where they drive everywhere. At least the millennial generation that are looking for cities to move to.
All right, that's all the time we have for questions.
Yeah,
So
and
once
these were
again-
great. Thank you. Great
Yeah.
discussion.
Wonderful.